key to understanding all of the cosmology, astrology, and astronomy that's in the Shrimad Bhagavatam is to realize that they're talking about two axes of motion. So the first axis of motion, we can call it the y-axis. It's the vertical axis. And the other one, we can call it the x-axis or the horizontal axis. There's astronomical motion and thus astrological relevance on both of these axes. The vertical axis has to do or is created by the Earth's revolution around the sun. And its unit of time, therefore, is a year, the amount of time it takes to do so. The horizontal axis, on the other hand, is caused by the Earth's rotation on its own axis. And the unit of time on this axis is the day. The astrological relevance of the y-axis is that it will create the 12 zodiac signs. And the astrological relevance of the x-axis or the horizontal axis is that it will mirror those 12 zodiac divisions onto a daily paradigm, creating the 12 houses. In the Shrimad Bhagavatam, chapter 16 gave us the fundamentals that we need to be able to understand both of these axes, but it didn't really explain either of them in full detail. It mostly concentrated on explaining the Earth. So now in chapter 20, we get a lot of detail about the x-axis, which creates the 12 houses. And in chapter 21, we'll get a lot of detail about the y-axis, the vertical axis, which creates the 12 signs. So first of all, here, just to orient ourselves, here is a cosmic horizontal cross-section. So it has three major sections to it: Bu, Bhuva, and Swa. Swa is the interstellar space. Bhuva is interplanetary space. And Bu is intrasolar space. In other words, the area between us and the sun. If we put these two axes into this diagram, the vertical axis will expand to cover how things are moving in interplanetary space, because it's about how those objects, like the sun and so forth, are apparently revolving around us. Or truthfully, how those objects are revolving around the sun. Whereas the horizontal axis will shrink to be confined within Bu, or the intrasolar space, because it's about how the Earth itself is turning on its own axis. Now, if we look in more detail at the intrasolar cross-section, the stuff that's within the area of Bu Mandala, in the middle of the whole model is this thing called Jambu, which is where we exist. It's what we call the Earth. Then concentrically around that, between us and the sun, there's all these other realms, starting with Plaksha, the fig, which has to do with Surya, followed by the next realm, which is twice as large as that, Shalmala, which has to do with Soma, the moon god. And again, this whole pattern repeats. Twice as big as that is Kusha, which has to do with Agni. And twice as big as that, outside that, is Krauncha, which has to do with Varuna. And then outside that still, we have Shaka, which has to do with Vayu. So you've got the Earth, the solar zone, the lunar zone, and then a zone for fire, water, and air, the three primary elements. After that, the final zone is Pushkara, which has to do with Brahma, the creator. Exactly what these realms are is difficult to say. What are they in terms of what we know about when we look out with our eyes or with our telescopes? It's difficult to say that because Shuk has already clarified that human beings don't see these realms unless they take great pains to gain siddhis or perfections of perception. The beings that dwell in these other realms between the earth and the sun, which are not planets, they are like supra-human versions of Earth. And they have those kind of siddhis naturally inborn in them. They have these higher types of perception. So I can't really say right now what these things are observationally. In some sense, it seems like the Surya zone is where the sun has actually heated the atmosphere, and the Soma zone is where it's cooled. And the Agni zone is the extent to which smoke can go, and the Varuna zone may be the extent to which moisture can go. And then the Vayu is just the empty zone. And then there's Pushkar, the solar zone, where the sun actually is. So now let's map the ecliptic onto these 7 concentric intrasolar zones. The ecliptic is said to be rooted to this gigantic circular ridge, which is exactly in the middle of this Pushkar zone. This ridge or this mountain is called Manasotara, which means the supreme animator, because that is Savitri, or the sun. So in other words, the sun has an axis that goes from the middle of the world, Meru, and rests on that on one side, and on the other side it rests on this Manasotara. And the sun is not exactly on the outside edge, but it's in from the outside edge, and it moves around like a grinder, an old-fashioned grinder. So the description of the sun in this 20th chapter is, all of these things are allegorically or poetically or beautifully described, because that's the nature of this book. It's bhakti-oriented, so it presents things in a very emotionally evocative way. It's not a dry technical manual. So it describes the sun as a giant 100,000 petaled lotus whose petals are golden flame. And atop this lotus is the abode of Brahma, the creator, because the sun is the thing which actually creates all the planets and all the worlds, etc., and creates all the life. Now, a very important statement in this 20th chapter is that most of space is uninhabitable, which is kind of shocking news for people who are in the spiritual circles, and they hear most of the gurus are saying things like the whole universe is inhabited, there's creatures on every planet, and so forth. Definitely the Bhagavatam is saying there's regions besides the earth which are inhabited by sentient beings, but it's not saying that all the rocks out there in space have organic life forms on them. In fact, what it's actually saying directly in this chapter is that the only inhabitable zone in the cosmos is where the sun interacts with the earth. Where the sun doesn't interact with the earth, it is uninhabitable, and even at some distances entirely inaccessible or void. Now, how will we translate this ecliptic into 12 houses? It's exactly the same way that it's translated into 12 signs, but it's mirrored on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. So Shuka, the narrator of Bhagavatam, says at the 4 cardinal points on this ecliptical ridge are the cities in which the 4 gods of the 4 directions dwell. So those are the daily equivalents of the 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. And then he says, each zone has 7 giri, or 7 markers, which demark subzones within each concentric area. These 7 giri markers are located in the easternmost part, and the zones are created by their extension out west. So if we look at what that looks like, following the geometry given in chapter 16, or just following any common sense geometry, if you take a hemisphere, like an eastern hemisphere, and you divide it by 7 radiuses, you'll get 30-degree segments. Now, if you draw diameters through these 30-degree segments, it looks very familiar, doesn't it? Now, you can locate the mountains and the borders of the zones that they create by extending out west in each zone, and this also looks awfully familiar, doesn't it? Number 1, it looks exactly the way chapter 16 described the earth. Number 2, it looks exactly the way we describe the earth to this day, with these latitudes that mark the tropics and the Arctic based on the equator and the poles. And most interestingly, now we finally have our 12-fold daily ecliptic, horizontal ecliptic, or horizontal zodiac, in other words, 12 houses, in which the sun moves around on a daily basis along with all the other visible planets.